Welcome back to our podcast. In today's episode, we are diving into occupational hygiene as a career. We talk about what it really is, what the day-to-day work looks like, and how it differs from general safety roles. We will also talk about how someone can get into this field, what skills matter, what the career path can look like for those interested in protecting worker health, specifically in worker exposure. Joining us today is Natasha Edwards, our operations manager here at Jada Solutions. She has almost 2 decades of experience in the industry as a health and safety consultant, helping clients navigate health and safety requirements across industrial, commercial, and government sectors. Her focus is on making sure operations run efficiently, regulatory requirements are met, and worker health is protected through practical, real-world controls. Natasha is also deeply passionate about educating both clients and workers on occupational hygiene hazards and about building safer workplaces through awareness, prevention, and continuous improvement. So let's get into it. Most people don't really understand what we do as a hygienist.
We primarily focus more on the health side of safety.
But there are other misconceptions out there about what we do and how we go about doing things. And
it was a pretty traumatic incident to recover from.
If we don't collect the right samples on the right media and send it to the lab and say, look for this, they don't know.
People will ask me, what are some of the coolest things you've ever seen?
What I love about consulting is we have a new experience here.
And just a couple of weeks ago, for the very first time in 18 years, I had somebody ask me,
Natasha, I'd like to thank you for joining us today on our podcast, and I'm looking forward to learning a little more about you and a little bit more about, what you think about the occupational hygiene field. I think first we'd like our audience to learn a little bit about your background. So how did you get started in the industry?
Well, after high school, I was studying a Bachelor of Arts in Psychology, and I was planning on being an elementary school teacher. As a summer job, I was operating heavy equipment, and I was involved in a workplace incident. And it was a pretty traumatic incident to recover from. The incident was investigated by OHS, and I was told that if the incident had occurred 1 second later, I likely wouldn't be here with us today. Oh, wow. And that was a turning point that made me realize the importance of health and safety, the importance of companies having the proper policies and procedures in place and ensuring that those procedures are occurring on a job site. So that's where my career had shifted, and I had started working in the health and safety field. My first 2 years in the field was directly with health and safety, but the primary components of my position were dealing with occupational hazards, confined space, supplied breathing air. I worked in the oil and gas field and in power plants doing shutdowns, and I realized that hygiene was the area of health and safety that really sparked my interest. So that's where it all started.
And then what was your first career as a hygienist? Where did you start there?
I started at a company called DF Technical. It was located here in Edmonton. I worked there for 16 years. Probably about 4 years before my departure of the company, it was bought out by another company called MBC Engineering Group.
And what type of hygiene work did you do while you were there?
I done a little bit of everything, but my primary role was the senior hygienist for our hygiene division. So the way we broke out the workflow, we had an asbestos and a mold division and a hygiene division. So I managed everything that came in for the hygiene. So that would be like chemical exposures, noise exposures. Of course, while doing some of those assessments, it did involve mold and asbestos surveys. When I wasn't busy with the hygiene work, then I would assist the other divisions of the company as well.
Okay.
So it really just depended on what workflow looked like. It could be one asbestos job every 3 months to maybe 3 a week.
Yeah, it varies on what comes through the door. Obviously, even here at Jada, we could have 5 asbestos jobs and 1 hygiene job, or we could have 15 hygiene jobs and 1 asbestos job, or one mold job or something like that. So yeah, I understand the variation in that workflow. And I understand, what it takes to sort of keep popping your mind from like, you have to sort of shift from like silica to asbestos to noise. How do you manage that? Like, how do you manage, juggling that knowledge and having to shift frequently as a consultant?
I have pretty well always consulted, so it's just the way I developed my skills. I've never really thought about shifting from one area of expertise to the other. Most of the controls and the processes are very similar. So once you learn information about one environment, you can utilize that in another. I guess the major difference is when you're doing hygiene assessments, you're primarily attending the site, you're overseeing the hazards, you're evaluating them, you're collecting samples, and you're providing recommendations. It's typically in a report. Sometimes that report is discussed with the clients and their stakeholders. Whereas when you're dealing with asbestos projects, you're on site daily and you're communicating with the frontline workers and the project managers. And there's a lot more challenges to deal with on the day-to-day basis when you're working in the abatement industry.
Yeah, no, for sure. There's and different challenges because we have a lot more responsibility day to day to oversee what they're doing versus on a hygiene job where we're going in. Mm-hmm. We're not necessarily there to oversee. We're there to collect and observe and then make recommendations and report. So that variation in responsibility does change depending on that type of project. So.
And with hygiene jobs, the client is typically happy to see you come. And sometimes in the abatement industry, they're happy to see you go. But either way, we're there to achieve the same goal. So as long as that goal is being achieved, that's all that matters at the end of the day.
So most people don't really understand what we do as a hygienist. Like, I mean, even safety people sometimes struggle with what we do and what we and how we go about doing things. And so how do you explain to a lay person or to that safety person what we do and the value, that or where we can help them out in that sort of plain language way?
For sure. I always say that we primarily focus more on the health side of safety. We look at a lot of invisible hazards. So when we look at a safety professional, they're dealing more with incident and injury prevention, whereas we're looking at the long-term disease development. So on-scene hazards, like it could be noise, radiation, vibration, chemical exposures, biological exposures that are inside of the environment.
Yeah, and it's very different than what the typical safety person would do from a day-to-day basis versus what we do.
Absolutely.
So yeah, very, very, very different. And so when you talk about that with them, how do you see that fit? So where we sort of fit into the overall, like, talking with owners of businesses and the safety professionals, explain to them where we fit in that relationship. How do you go about that?
I guess that would really depend on which type of questions were asked. But I do try to explain to them that it is two different fields, that we specialize in a different area. And I usually make the conversation specific to their facility. So if it was a welding shop, I may say, your safety person, their responsibility is to ensure that the welders are wearing their respirators and they're using the local exhaust ventilation. Whereas myself as a hygienist, my responsibility is to determine, is that ventilation efficient at removing the airborne particulate and fume concentration in the environment? Is the respiratory protection enough to protect the worker? What other hazards are in the environment? Is the ozone being depleted? So we're just, we're looking at two different sides of the same coin.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's that overlap of where they relate is, we come at it, like you said, we're looking at that worker exposure perspective, and we're coming at it from the perspective of, do they have the right respiratory protection in place? Do they have the right ventilation in place? Whereas the safety professional is looking at it from, are they properly trained to use that respiratory protection and to use that ventilation so that it does what it's supposed to do and protect the worker. And so both sides of that coin really come together right there for the worker and for worker safety is really, I get it a lot, the misconception, especially on the pricing side, where everyone sort of thinks it's an episode of CSI and we've got one piece of machinery and we can walk into the room and go, here's what you're exposed to and here's what levels you're exposed to. But there are other misconceptions out there about what we do and how we go about doing things. And what do you encounter normally in your workday with stuff like that?
Just to circle back on your conversation there regarding one instrument detecting all airborne contaminants. I have that conversation frequently, and I explain it to clients in the way that if you went to the doctors and requested blood work, they're only going to find problems for what they look for. They're not going to find, a vitamin K deficiency if they're not looking for it in your blood.
Right. Yeah. So how we use the lab specifically, if we don't collect the right samples on the right media and send it to the lab and say, look for this, they don't know.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that's a part of being a hygienist, is to determine what needs to be sampled for in which environments.
And methodologies are different. Like, silica has a couple different methodologies. Asbestos has a few different methodologies. And so understanding those, which methodology is the correct one to use in this scenario, takes a little bit of time for us to figure out. Like that's another, I think, misconception we see a lot in the field is that, well, you do this every day. This should be really easy for you to put a quote together, but each shop is a little bit different. You talked welding before. Each of those manufacturing shops, some use MIG welding, some use TIG welding, some have ozone, so each of those shops are a little different. Some are welding on stainless steel, some aren't. So again, we're looking at different components and different metals. And so how we go about that process really varies. And the methodology or the number of metals we might be looking for will vary on shop to shop and stuff like that. And people really don't understand that detail. They just think we can go out and push air through a filter and give them every answer they need, or walk out with a piece of machinery and it measures everything and give them an answer. And I think there's a lot of sticker shock in the world about like, why does this shit cost like $500? I don't understand why it doesn't cost $500. And you're like, well, the rental equipment alone is $1,000, and then there's our time and the report and the research we might have to do both before and after to make sure we do it all correctly. And
if such instrument existed, there wouldn't be occupational hygienist.
Every person on the planet would own it.
Yeah. Another misconception, when people hear the title occupational hygienist, I always pause and I don't say anything. I like to watch their facial expressions because I see a lot of things going on upstairs. And I always like to ask, do you know what that is? And the most common answers I get is, you do something with teeth, or they're like, you take care of a worker's cleanliness.
The cleanliness one I see a lot. It says, we teach people how to wash their hands properly, right? And it's like,
we could, technically.
We do. I mean, yeah, I've done that with lead exposure before, but no, it's definitely much more involved. We look at the entire body and that exposure. So yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions out there, and it's one of the things, I like about working with you is that you pride yourself on educating the client on, here's what's going on, here's what we need to do, walking them through the process so that they have a full understanding, so they can make an informed decision on what's best for their shop and what do they need to do, how can they satisfy that OHS order or just the worker complaint or whatever it might be. And so I've noticed you're really, really good at just having that patience with the clients to we'll have a 30-minute conversation and I'll explain what I do with you. And I have to do that 5 times a day to 5 different clients and walk them through those misconceptions and generalities and get them to focus on the true need and the true solution to what their problems are. And that's another common misconception is like, we'll just call the hygienist, and it's like we show up and I'm like, well, You know what I want you to do? I can already see 5 problems that I'm going to recommend. I want you to change those five things, and then we'll come in and do air monitoring, because I guarantee if you fix those 5 things, when we do our air monitoring, we're going to see that everything's okay after you make those changes. And so there's this misconception that we're just out to collect money and there's no value add to their system. But like, it's very easy for me to go up, see those problems, collect money, tell them to make those changes. And once you make those changes, we need to do more air monitoring to prove those changes are effective. And then I can bill them twice for the same job, even though I know we can solve those problems and go and do it once. And so
Absolutely.
There's a lot of that misconception. Like, they just feel like we're out to take money from them and out to be a money grab. Absolutely. And they don't understand that value.
One of the worst parts of my job throughout my career is, asking clients for money to pay for assessments. I always wish that it was a service that we were able to provide at no charge, but a business doesn't operate like that.
Yeah.
Even if we look at a visit to an optometrist, it's important. Your vision is a necessary part of your health, but it's not covered by Alberta Health Services.
Yeah, it's one of the things that has to get done, in that, it's not that it's different from safety in that it's not necessarily a day-to-day part of everything that they do. We can come in once a year, twice a year, once every couple of years or 3 years, do our air monitoring, make our recommendations, have them follow through, come back a couple of years later or a year later, redo the monitoring again, confirm everything is still working. And so that interaction with us, they don't see us every day, so they don't think about that part of their risk assessment when they do a lot of the stuff that they do. They take it for granted. That, well, I've got my respirator, so I'm safe with the welding fumes. But the minute they change something, they don't realize, well, that might change the respiratory protection that you need.
I was actually at a facility last week, and I conducted a walkthrough for the client. And the business owner came in as I was leaving, and he asked me if I noticed anything that was an immediate hazard in the shop that I'd like to point out. I explained that the filters that they were wearing in their welding area were incorrect, and the filters that they were wearing in their manufacturing facility, shall we say, was also incorrect, and that if they swapped the filters for both environments, that they would be right. Also, they created their own process out of a barbecue, and they were heating it with propane inside of a shop.
Ooh.
Yeah.
So there's something different there going on that had to be looked at and adjusted.
Absolutely. They're putting combustion byproducts and carbon monoxide into an area where workers are working. And we all know that carbon monoxide is a silent killer.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And that really brings me up to sort of that relationship between what we do, what the safety professional does, the owners, the managers of the businesses, and the workers, and how they see us and how we fit in. Mm-hmm. What's your experience with that?
Well, it's, I would say working with everyone is definitely a team collaboration. Everyone is important to be able to determine the risks in that facility. You have your management. Some management is very involved into the safety program. Others are not. We have our safety person. The level of involvement in the safety person really depends on the facility and their education and training. As we mentioned earlier, a hygienist looks more at the health hazards versus the safety hazards, even though we do include the safety hazards in our recommendations. We look at the invisible hazards, and communicating with the frontline workers is usually the most important part of a hygiene assessment. Being on the floor, asking the workers what they're doing, what they feel the immediate hazards are. I may be, an expert in hygiene, but when I walk into a facility and I'm there for one day, I rely on the workers that have been there for extended periods of time, and they see the day-to-day operations. So having that interview with the workers, it really provides a much fuller picture of what's happening, and it allows you to assess the hazards in a much more depth.
Yeah, and that's, a really important step of what we do as hygienists is having that candid conversation with the workers so that they can learn a little bit more about why we're there and what we're doing and why there's that value for them and what we're bringing on. And it shows management and the health and safety representatives like, hey, like we did this interview, we see a bit of a gap here between what you've got written versus what's going on. We need to align that gap and fix that gap. And so they see it as sort of a second set of eyes or a second audit on specific components of their safety program, because they get a hygienist to come in and look at their respiratory protection program from our lens versus just the standard OH&S lens of, do you talk about this? You talk about this, right? And then we're like, well, we want to go a step further in certain areas because you've got very specific hazards here that we want the workers to be aware of in terms of worker exposure.
For sure.
Yeah.
Earlier, you had asked about, kind of switching between different projects and how you manage that. Well, being a hygienist, there's many areas where you need to switch. Just going out to do an assessment, you're communicating with frontline workers and you're also communicating with stakeholders. So the way you communicate that information to different people needs to be much different. And I feel like that takes a lot of training to develop those skills. It may come naturally to some people, but, you can't communicate with someone that's been welding for 30 years about wearing his respiratory protection the same way as you're going to communicate that with the CEO of a company.
Yeah. They need different messages on why and what for, and the value add of doing it to what we, following through with our recommendations. And so, that style of communication is really, really important, and to make sure that we understand, what's going on here versus here, and making sure that, the CEO wants the high level. They don't need, they're very rarely saying, hey, you know what? I need a detailed conversation. They just want to know, what's the high level? What's the recommendation? How do we follow through with that recommendation? Have the conversation with our safety personnel, make sure they get that done. And then you go sit with the safety person and they start to go, okay, what about this? What about this? What about this? And they ask a little bit more detail. And the worker tends to be sort of in between because they don't want to understand. They don't need to understand the detail like the safety person does.
Yeah.
But at the same time, they want a little bit more than that higher level explanation we give the CEO so they can properly understand how it affects them long term if they don't follow through with our recommendations, right? So,
Absolutely.
And then that helps the safety professional because they all of a sudden now have buy-in because of the conversation we've had with the workers, because the workers are now going, all right, let's get my new filters on, let's get my different respirator on, let's get the ventilation adjusted or fixed. And so buy-in starts to happen from all levels with that different communication to everybody. So really important that you talk about, like you mentioned, that communication style. It's really, really important. And I think that's one of the values as an occupational hygienist that we bring to the table is we've got a different lens of how we look at things, and we've got a different way of communicating those things to those people. What other values do you see as an occupational hygienist that we bring to the table for an organization and their team?
Well, one thing is we're a fresh set of eyes. It doesn't matter if you have one safety person working for your facility or multiple, complacency can set in, and you're in the facility day after day, year after year, and you're seeing the same hazards. But when we come in with a fresh set of eyes, we can see things differently, even if it's just basic safety hazards.
Or even just how they've adapted the risk level. Like
Absolutely.
Because they see it every day and they deal with it every day, they tend to minimize that risk level. Whereas we're going, oh no, wait a minute. Like you've dropped this to a 3, we need it up at a 4, and we need to add this extra you should consider adding this extra thing or this extra thing to that risk level, to add to the controls. And so, yeah, you're right. That complacency at the work site really happens a lot, especially with people that tend to sit there for long periods of time. Sort of another important reason to have this type of work brought in is, like you say, it's a great audit tool to make sure that those types of things are being checked off and that complacency doesn't drop because of that lack of interaction. Let's talk about what are some of the signs that organizations should look for when they talk about bringing in an occupational hygienist, or if they need even an occupational hygienist to come in, versus do they just need a general safety person? Some
of the key factors are going to be, are you working with any chemicals or any other substance, whether it's a dust, a particulate? Is there anything in your facility that's noisy or producing radiation? There are, if you need high-level hazard assessment on something like a confined space that has potential to have deadly gases in the environment or oxygen deficiency.
Yeah, no, those are all really great examples. And I think that's the difference between the safety professional and the hygienist, is that the safety professional can recognize, hey, we've got a noise hazard, or we've got this physical hazard, or this chemical hazard. But where they need the hygienist is that skill set to come in and assess those hazards and collect the data and collect the information, and then how it gets applied to the human body and what we saw on the site. So we're not just collecting data and it's a one and done. We're collecting, we're observing, we're putting all of that together to then make recommendations to improve, or to say that, hey, things are going really well here. We really like to see what we really like what you guys have been doing, and everything is fine on site. But even that, there's always little tweaks to the program, like, changes to manufacturers, like, hey, you guys, I noticed that you're not, changing out your filters on your ventilation on a weekly or monthly basis. We need to improve that because we see the clog and the reduce in volume on the filter. Or we could see that just how the smoke was moving while we're in the shop collecting our welding fume samples.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think pretty well all facilities would benefit from having an occasional visit from an occupational hygienist.
Yeah, I agree. I think the value add of bringing somebody in to do that, do those assessments and to perform those, like you say, mini audits on the noise program, or on the chemical exposure program, or the respiratory protection program, or their confined spaces. That lens we look through is a little bit different. Like we had a client come to us last year about their confined space program and said, hey, I want a hygienist to review this and sign off on it. And you and I went through the program and we made some I would call them moderate tweaks to their program to say, hey, like 90% of this is really good, but you've missed this, and this that we want you to do. And then we want you to add this and this to the type of monitoring you're doing in your confined spaces based on these hazards. And that really opened their eyes. Like, they were just like, holy man, like, how have we been missing this for, like, the last time they reviewed their confined space program was 5 years ago. And they're like, holy mackerel, we'll completely miss those hazards. How did we miss that? And it's just like, it's pretty commonplace to sometimes forget that, they focus on LEL and O2 and those types of things. And they don't focus on the adjacent hazards that can come into that place and affect what they're doing in there.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. Obviously, we're consultants, so we're a big fan of consultants, but there's a time where for an organization, there might be value add to having a full-time hygienist. When do you see that evolving for a company?
When the hazards in their facility fit more into the occupational hygiene realm versus the safety. So if you're a chemical manufacturing facility, you should definitely have a hygienist on board. So if you're dealing with a lot of those hazards on a day-to-day basis, it is a bit above the expertise of a safety professional.
Yeah, it definitely can be. And when you're talking about those chemical exposures and you're talking about those, physical hazards, whatever it might be in the workplace, noise, whatever, if you've got a lot of that going on in your shop, the value add to having a full-time hygienist is that, well, they can take care of the safety side, but then they can also internalize your monitoring program. They can help you buy equipment that is stationary and is constantly running, so that they can constantly interpret that data for you to give you that feedback that you need. And like you say, those chemical manufacturing plants, they've got that worker exposure. They've got, you look at oil and gas facilities, having those hygienists on site full time. It's one of the things I took away. We had we were both at the AIHA Connect last week, and we got to sit down with for dinner with a lot of oil and gas safety professionals from Canada, and listening to them talk about, one of the value adds that those hygienists bring full time from the oil and gas sites. It's not just recognizing the hazards and how to evaluate the hazards. They usually outsource that to an organization like us, like they're busy, but they can look at, hey, we don't really have an OEL or good data to support this OEL. Let's do a research project. And so having those full-time hygienists, listening to them talk about some of the research projects that they did, or that their occupational health team did on the exposures in the work site, and the value that brought back to the safety team, if it was done by the health team, to the hygienists and the safety professionals, so they could go back and look at their worker exposure, and they can go, yeah, the OEL might be here, but maybe we want to set a bit of a lower standard on our work site because this study showed this long-term health issue, or this study showed this issue or that issue. And so listening to those research projects, I thought was like, that's an extremely valuable thing that those occupational hygienists are bringing to those work sites and working with those teams. And yeah, that was for me, was a huge takeaway from that dinner.
Absolutely. And, in our industry, there's lots of OELs for common workplace chemicals, but there's also many, many substances that do not have an OEL. So how do you evaluate the worker's exposure? That's why you need a hygienist, because there's lots of toxic substance out there and they haven't been studied or have an OEL, but we know they're toxic. So we can look at other methods and control measures to put in place to ensure the worker's health.
Yeah, and I think it's like, you look at just taking Alberta as an example, we have like 900 chemicals we have OELs for under the Alberta OHS Act Regulation and Code. And then you look at, but we have the possibility of like almost 200,000 chemicals that are being used in Alberta on a daily, weekly basis. And it's like, holy mackerel, like we're just a drop in the bucket of what we have exposure limits and controls for. And so, one of the other big things, we have a conversation about is how can we sample for something like that when we don't have an OEL, or we don't have a proper methodology to sample for something like that. And that becomes very tricky. And a lot of it doesn't necessarily boil down to doing exposure monitoring, but doing some control banding. So it's like, hey, you know what? We know these chemicals react in the same way. Let's look for this chemical. Or maybe we need to implement a biological monitoring program because we know that, if we look for these markers in urine or blood or whatever, that's a marker that shows worker exposure to this. And so we can come at that work site and make that change. What's your experience with that? Like, have you had those difficult sites where you're like, oh my God, how are we going to sample for this chemical? What am I going to do?
Absolutely. Sometimes I wish I haven't, but we see that all too common.
Yeah.
There's lots of different ways to look at it, but, it's extremely difficult if you're working for a client who doesn't have many regulated substances in their facility, and you're sampling for parameters that don't have an OEL, and you're trying to recommend controls when you don't have legislation to back you up.
Yeah. And trying to show them that, like, hey, look, we should introduce, get away from oil and gas sites. How many manufacturers have a true biological monitoring program in place? How many chemical organizations, how many of those organizations really have that? Mm-hmm. Few to none would be my answer. And so how do we go about convincing them that introducing those biological monitoring programs might be important? Talking about hygienists, and talking about, the value we bring to these organizations, picking the right hygienist, picking the right hygienist for your organization can be just as important. So what are some of the factors you think that owners or safety professionals should look at when they're picking a hygienist?
Well, there's a combination of things. Education and training is important, and experience. Experience is extremely important because if somebody just graduated from school and they have all the alphabet beside their name, but they've never been inside of these facilities, they don't have that real life experience. And that's where you're going to learn the most. And all of your education and the pieces of the puzzle are going to come together when you're out in the field and you're observing those changes. A person's communication style is also very important. We had touched earlier on the different communication styles with different levels of the organization. It's very important that a hygienist is able to practice behavioral-based safety and able to communicate with those frontline workers because you're going to be working with them a majority of the time.
Yeah, and you're going to realize right away, like just their communication style with, I think a lot of our clients, there's a lot of comfort in the fact that we have those conversations while we're working on their proposal and we're talking to them, emailing them, having those conversations. And so all of a sudden they realize, hey, like they're answering questions. They're not just looking for answers from me, but they're answering my questions. And there's that give and take in that relationship. Mm-hmm. And so that builds that level of trust and that level of comfort that a lot of organizations want when they're looking at a hygienist, because there's a million people out there that claim they can do this type of work, but the reality is, what's the value they're bringing to the table for that company?
It's also very important to be able to adjust your communication style on the fly because not everybody needs the same type of response, the same type of tone. Yeah. I myself am a very empathetic person. So when I'm speaking with people, I read their body language very well. And that helps me understand how I need to present the information to them.
Yeah, no, for sure. That's definitely valuable. And so, we've talked about that type of stuff. But one of the things that I always emphasize, because I hear this a lot, is like, well, the guy did this work. It's been rejected by OH&S. Now I can't get a hold of them. And they're calling us to see if we can fix the problem. And one of the first things I always ask is, well, did they have a designation behind their name? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, are they a CIH? Are they an ROH, ROHT? Are they a PNG? What, like CRSP? Like, do they have a designation behind their name? And usually the answer is no. And I go, well, that's problem number one. I said, right now we're sitting in basically an unregulated industry. I know Alberta has started to enforce. BC, you're seeing a little more enforcement on it as well, where they've laid out like, these are what a safety professional do. These are what a hygienist can do. And they've gone a step further to say CIH, ROH as the hygienist and CRSP as the safety professional. Whereas other provinces haven't. But you go back and you go, well, even before Alberta was starting to do that type of stuff, my comment to the clients was, you want to hire people that have designations after my name. I've got the alphabet soup. I've got 2 safety designations, 2 hygiene designations, and an environmental designation. And the reason I have that is I practice in all of those areas. And so the value add to the client is that if I make a big enough mistake or grievance and I ignore you on that you can now go after the certifying body and say, hey, we've got a problem with what Jason did. Here's where we think a mistake was made. He doesn't want to acknowledge where that mistake is. We'd like you to come and review the situation and assess whether he is competent to do this type of work. Having that protection, really helps those companies in acknowledging that they're bringing in good people to do that type of work. So it's one of the first things we always say is, we get that all the time. It's like we quote for a noise assessment, it's $3,500, and they go, well, we just got a quote from another guy who's willing to do it for $2,000. And my first question out of my mouth is, are they a CIH ROH? Right? Are they an industrial hygienist? And if the answer is no, I go, you're going to have a problem with OH&S getting this report certified. There's probably going to be issues with the report. And so the value of that designation. What do you think the value of you've got the ROHT designation? What's that value to you and to those clients?
It's extremely valuable. I've been in the industry for 18 years, and I've seen a lot of fly-by-night companies come up and complete assessments incorrectly. I've had the opportunity to review lots of reports that were produced by other companies. I've worked alongside of other hygiene firms, if you're dealing with a multi-loss situation and there's mistakes being made. And we had talked about a lot of people don't really understand what an occupational hygienist does. So, if you're a company and you're trying to hire someone to assess your air quality, you don't really know what you're looking for. But thankfully, Alberta Occupational Health and Safety has put some control measures in place, and now they are ensuring that the work is done by experts in the industry, so it's done properly. There are a lot of things that could go wrong during an assessment. If you're doing a large assessment, it's very rare that everything's going to work out as planned. You always need to be making decisions on the fly and changing a plan, whether that's a work process is changing or the duration of that process is changing. You always need to be able to make those decisions. And it's just great that it's being taken, our profession is being taken more serious in this province. And historically, when OHS would show up to audit one of my jobs, it was almost like we were colleagues, They chatted with me about what the worker's done, but now they're actually writing compliance orders for us. They want to see our field notes, our sampling data. They want to know what we did on the job if things weren't going right. So I'm just really happy to see that accountability.
Yeah, no, it is really great to see. So let's talk about, we talked about how you got into the industry, and you had that inciting incident with the accident and it pushed you into safety. And then from safety, you moved into hygiene. But when we talk about industrial hygienists, again, the specialties vary. Mm-hmm. What do you think about that? What do you see versus being the specialist versus the generalist? And what would you recommend to other professionals or the students that are now looking to get into the industry? They're getting into the health and safety industry. And do they want to be a generalist in safety or a generalist in hygiene? Do they want to be a specialist in a very specific area? What would be your recommendation?
Well, I think every safety professional should be required to do a co-op in hygiene. Mm-hmm. I think it's very valuable, but some people love hygiene and some people don't, to each your own.
We've got a younger generation coming up, and our organization, that's one of the things. We bring in the younger people, we mentor them, and then they're off to do their own thing with their careers. And so bringing in that younger generation, what's your advice on that career path?
Is to find the area that you shine in. So my very first job in health and safety was for a company called United Safety. It is an entry-level position, and you don't need any safety designations to work there. And they do lots of shutdowns in oil and gas. And it was an amazing stepping stone into the industry for me. I got to see so many hazards, and I was provided with lots of training at no charge. Once I started there, I knew that I loved it, and I decided to do my NCSO. And then after, working in the industry for a bit, I done a certificate in occupational health and safety. If you come out of school and you just go work for a welding shop, I feel like your education or your field experience will be very limited. I think you should find some place to work where you have the opportunity to see a lot in the industry, so you know where you're going to fit in.
Yeah, and I think that's why I fell in love with consulting, is that, one day we're on an oil and gas site, the next site we're out of manufacturing, the next we're at a hospital, the next we're at a commercial site, the next we're on a construction site. So we're getting that wide variety in the industry, and then we're getting that wide variety of types of work that we get to do, from program review to exposure monitoring to this to that to whatever.
Absolutely.
And so, Yeah. But again, consulting is not for everybody. You have to we are high intensity, high workload for a long period of time, and you've got to be able to handle that stress and that volume of work.
Yeah, you need to be the type of person that needs to be busy all the time, and you enjoy having a to-do list longer than you can ever get done.
That's right. Every time you cross off 3 things, 5 more things get added to your to-do list. So I know exactly where you're coming from. You fell in love with it. Why? What are you doing here that's giving you that rewarding feeling, or with this profession that gives you that rewarding feeling?
I like to help people. A lot of people think that safety is about compliance or checklist and processes, but it's not. They're just what is in place to make sure the job is being done properly. It's to protect workers.
And I think that's a common theme amongst a lot of people that get into occupational hygiene, is that they're either very science driven, and so they enjoy the science side of things, and they want to do the research. They want to be the research hygienist or whatever. Or they're like you and I. We love being the generalist. I like being able to help people and advise on how to improve things. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, you sort of see that double side of the coin.
I also love the science. I love toxicology. And it's funny because, back when I was in high school and trying to determine what I was going to study, I heard so many people tell me to study sciences. They said, you can go anywheres with science, but arts will limit you. And I said, I don't want to do anything in the science field. And I hear that in my head all the time. And now I'm always offering that bit of advice to the younger generation. Like, you can go anywheres with sciences.
Yeah. I remember coming out of high school, going into college and university, I was very I want to do environmental. I want to do environmental work. I blah, 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 blah. And my first practicum, it is November. It's minus 30 out, or it's about minus 10 out at this stage. And I have to collect groundwater samples. And my fingertips were frozen, my toes were frozen, my ears were frozen. And I got back from that project and I looked at my boss and I said, I'd like to go work in the hygiene hazmat division now. I don't want to be outside anymore at all in the cold collecting water samples. Yeah. And he had a good chuckle. He's like, yeah, it's not for everybody, right? You say, you got to find what you like and what you do. And that's what pushed me into the hygiene side of things, was I knew I wanted to be in this HSE field. Yeah. And then narrowed it down to, I don't like environmental because it gets cold. I don't like safety because I don't like sitting at my computer all day. I like to be out and interacting with people and having conversations. And so, okay, hygiene, that seems more where my passions lie. Yeah. And so now when I look at it though, and I look at the future and I say, what's in place for us as occupational hygienists in the future? And I'm getting nervous. And I'm getting nervous because when I look at the stats of, what they're reporting, for every 5 hygienists that retire, there's only about 3 coming back to replace them, right? We're only adding 3 more to replace them. And so we're a shrinking industry, yet the demand for occupational hygienists is growing almost exponentially. And so what would you say to those young people to say, get into hygiene?
Well, first off, it's really hard to believe that. I don't have any particular statistics to speak to, but when I got into the field 18 years ago, having your NCSO was kind of like a gold standard to start there. And we have so many occupational health and safety programs across the country. So the industry is growing really rapidly. And all of these programs have occupational hygiene courses. I think, a big disconnect is there's a lot of students that are going through school and they like hygiene, but they don't know how to get into the industry. All they really have to do is, one of the building blocks to be a hygienist is to have that safety background. So if you come out of school as a safety person, sign up, send a resume to an occupational hygiene firm. They're always looking for junior staff to mentor.
Yeah, 100% they are.
Yeah.
And it really makes me nervous. You see the declining number in the CRBOH and how they're struggling to get people to sign on. And I think a lot of that stems from when we started in the industry, like you say, the NCSO or the CRSP were sort of the gold standard, and there wasn't a lot of pressure for us to go after our hygiene designations. There wasn't that government need or that regulatory need to get those designations. Even the safety designations, there was no regulatory need to get them. Mm-hmm. They just were, for those of us that like to excel, we'd get those designations to show competency. It was an easy way to show competency. And so a lot of people now are 10, 20 years into their careers. They didn't go that direction to show competency and get those designations or have the right educational background. And so that's why we're seeing that reduction in numbers of what's going on. And I'm speaking North American wide, like America, Canada, like those numbers aren't just Canadian numbers, but in America, that's what they're showing off, is like for every 5 that retire, 3 are coming to replace them. And not all of them are coming in at the CIH ROH level. A lot are coming in at the ROHT level. And so there's a gap there that needs to be filled, because, if you were to follow the government's or the Alberta recommendations to its trueness, I guess, they don't see the ROHT as someone who's able to mentor other people into becoming good hygienists. And that's, a fundamental point that I completely disagree with, because I think the ROHT, CIH designations, they help to show competency in technical, from a technical perspective. The CIH, ROH help to show a little bit of competency in towards leadership. But leadership, I've met a million CIHs, I've met a lot of CIHs, ROHs that should not be leaders in the industry or mentoring other people. They're more suited for research, or they're more suited for just working on their own.
Absolutely.
And I've met more on the ROHT side that are suitable to be mentors and good mentors to the upcoming generation. And so I think your work experience, your personality, your attitude, and a little bit of your education, like yourself, you've got a degree in education. That's a pretty valuable degree in learning how, like you say, human nature, how to communicate, communication styles, all those different things that have helped you develop your career over the last year that make you very strong at what you do.
Yeah, and I do believe that's a very complex topic, because experience is critical. And, we may see CIH, ROHs who have come out of school with maybe a science degree or a master's in public health, and they've only ever worked for one industry. Maybe they've never consulted, so they don't have that broad view. When we look at the ROHT designation, we're seeing a lot more people trying to obtain it because of those changes with occupational health and safety, but I'm not necessarily sure that that's a good thing. I worked in the industry for years without being a registered hygienist, and it was a personal goal of mine to become a registered hygienist because of the knowledge that I held in my head. I felt like I deserved to have a designation beside my name, but a lot of people are rushing in to get their ROHT now because it's required to sign off on your own work.
Yeah.
But it's, what is the competency profile? I know people who have become ROHTs that have only ever worked in asbestos and mold. And now we're putting letters beside their names saying that they can go into a manufacturing facility. So yeah, it's a very complex topic.
Yeah, a very double-edged sword there too. Like you say, you can be an expert in asbestos and mold and indoor air quality and know very little about the manufacturing side. And, I would say that's that evolution of my career. I started in that side with the asbestos and mold and indoor air quality. And then as I gained competency in those areas, my boss felt comfortable enough to move me into other areas. And so I started to do noise assessments. I started to do, chemical exposure assessments. I started to do different things. And then as I evolved, even here at JADA, there's always that, am I good enough to take on an oil and gas job now? Or do I need a few more years of experience before I move into that industry? And I was very lucky to be surrounded by people that were more confident in me than I was in myself to say, Jay, you're smart enough to figure this out. Let's go talk to the client and let them know. And we'll be honest with the client. We're not going to lie. We're just going to say, hey, our experience in oil and gas is minimal, but we think we can help you out. And here's what our research has shown. And here's what we should be going after and doing. And 9 times out of 10, we always got buy-in because of that confidence to say, and that research. We sat down and did the legwork before we went to site and didn't panic and everything like that.
And, a lot of clients don't ask you what your experience is in that industry. And just a couple of weeks ago, for the very first time in 18 years, I had somebody ask me, what experience do you have dealing with foundries? And I said, to be honest, I have never done a foundry before. However, let me tell you about the products that are inside of your foundry that you're working with. And let me tell you about my 16 years experience dealing with metals and isocyanates and formaldehyde and, so.
On different projects. Yeah.
Yes. So I say, I actually haven't seen this process. I've studied about this process, but I understand the contaminants that you're working with, how they affect the body, and the controls that need to be in place.
Yeah. And it's what I love about consulting is like, hey, we have a new experience here. We get to work at a foundry.
Absolutely.
Hey, we have a new experience today. We get to work in this process or that process. So.
And a lot of times people will ask me, what are some of the coolest things you've ever seen? And, I always explain it. One day, I could be doing an air quality assessment in a lawyer's office and I'm wearing a blazer. The next day, I could be crawling around in a sewer backup. I have been to properties where there's homicides and we're going in and testing for hazardous materials before the cleanup crew can come in. I've also watched bodies being bombed, and that's probably one of the coolest things I did.
Yeah.
And it definitely takes a special type of person to be able to deal with that. I done a significant amount of work with a local funeral home. When they embalm bodies, they use the embalming fluid is composed of formaldehyde and methanol, and so the workers that are embalming the bodies are exposed to this. The very first day I had showed up on site, I remember seeing a body laying on a stretcher and it shocked me. I had dreams about it. I could see the body in my head, but eventually I was there so many times. Theoretically, I could have ate a sandwich and watched the body be embalmed because I became so used to it.
I can't imagine.
Not that I would eat in a process area. That's completely against occupational hygiene.
But I know what you're saying.
Of speech.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Is you got so comfortable with the situation over time that it just became normal.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's pretty good. So we ask everybody who comes and joins us at our podcast one sort of final question, golden question that we have for everybody. And so I'd like to ask you the same question. If you could set the record straight on one common misunderstanding about safety, what would it be?
Oh, that we're not safety cops. That safety is about people.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And I totally agree with you. It's one of those things that like everyone thinks that we're there to rat them out. And the reality is we're not here to rat you out. We're here to make sure that you go home safe, all 5 fingers, all 5 toes. Like that's the reality of it. We want you to go home safe and whole. So yeah, no, that's a great answer.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Natasha, for your time. This was a great conversation. And I learned a little bit more about you. And that's always fun for me. So thank you again.
Great.